The first case is Rouse versus Cameron. The legal issue raised in this case is whether a person involuntarily committed to a mental hospital from not being guilty by reason of insanity has a right to treatment, and if so, how the violation of this right may be established. The case, Rouse versus Cameron, is about 18 years old Charles Rouse, who was involuntarily committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital and was being denied adequate treatment after he had been sent there. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was held at St. Elizabeth's for almost 5 years, even though his maximum sentence was 1 year. At the facility, he was not given any treatment for his mental condition. This appellant case took place on October 10, 1966, and the case was ultimately decided in the United States Court of Appeals, District of Columbia Circuit. The facts of the case are that Charles Rouse was stopped at approximately 1:45 a.m. by a police officer who had seen him carry a small but heavy suitcase. According to Rouse, he opened the suitcase on the police officer's order, and the case was found to contain a fully loaded .45 caliber automatic pistol and several hundred rounds of ammunition. Then the officer took Rouse into custody and seized the case and its contents. After consultation with his court-appointed attorney, a motion to suppress was filed on the ground that the search was incident to an unlawful arrest. The motion to suppress ended up not being heard. Instead, shortly after, Rouse's mother made a written statement stating that she believed her son was mentally ill and that he could benefit from treatment. The court requested examination at D.C. General Hospital, which reported that Rouse was able to understand the charges against him, and he was capable of assisting counsel in his own defense. The report also stated that he was suffering from a passive-aggressive personality disorder and that the crime was a product of his mental illness. The judge ruled that he was not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to the hospital. The maximum sentence for this criminal charge was 1 year, but years later from the hospital, Rouse filed a petition for habeas corpus, which is a legal action demanding that the detainee is brought before a judge to make sure that they are not being held illegally, to challenge his confinement. The plaintiff's side argued that he did not receive any treatment to better his mental condition when he was committed to St. Elizabeth's. The defendant argued that the treatment that Rouse preferred was not an option. Rouse's hospital records were examined, and the specific reasons for using or not using a certain type of therapy were found. Rouse refused group therapy, and the hospital had no alternative type of therapy at the hospital. Additionally, Congress established a statutory right to treatment in the 1964 Hospitalization of the Mentally Ill Act. The act says that a person hospitalized in a public hospital for a mental illness is entitled to medical and psychiatric care and treatment. The administrator at the public hospital must keep records of the treatment provided, and the records must be available with the person's written authorization to his or her attorney or personal physician. This act, however, is limited to those hospitalized under a statutory authorization, while other sections of the act only apply to those who are mentally ill, excluding those committed by court order in a criminal proceeding. Overall, the decisions of the court are that the committed mental patients have a right to treatment, and the government, when holding people involuntarily, have an obligation to provide psychiatric care. Additionally, the court ruled that the hospital should also be keeping record of all medical and psychiatric care and treatment that the patient is receiving. Then, the court examined whether a violation of the right to treatment was established. The court held that, according to leading experts, psychiatric care and treatment does not just include contact with the doctors, but also activities and contacts with the hospital staff to help improve the patient's state. The court requires hospitals to show that 1. Initial and periodic inquiries were made into the needs and conditions of the patient in a view toward providing them with a suitable treatment, and 2. The program provided was specific to meet the needs of the individual requiring treatment. Also, the court held that a hospital must attempt to provide treatment, and the lack of staff or facilities does not justify the failure to provide adequate treatment. Lastly, the court held that if a mandatorily committed patient was being held in violation of laws, a court could allow a hospital a reasonable opportunity to initiate treatment. Overall, this case is significant because it ensured the right to receive adequate treatment when involuntarily placed in a mental hospital. Alright, on to the next case, Wyatt versus Stickney. The legal issues to be decided for the case Wyatt versus Stickney include right to treatment on behalf of people with mental illnesses, establishment of constitutional right on behalf of those with mental retardation to keep improving skills and functioning of daily life, and the establishment of minimum standards with regards to safety, education, training, medication, nutrition, physical accommodations, staff-to-patient ratios, individualized treatment, and aftercare. The case started with Alabama's 1970 decision to cut its cigarette tax. Since the proceeds from this tax were designated for mental health services, this cut set off a chain of reductions in the state's mental health system, which included eliminating around 100 staff members from the Bryce State Hospital, which served primarily patients who were involuntarily committed for mental illness. Among the 100 staff members were 20 professionals, including psychologists, who were fired. So on October 23, 1970, the fired staff members filed a class action suit, which is where a group of people affected by the same action file a case against a defendant as a group. They filed this lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, requesting their positions back on the grounds that patients at this institution would receive inadequate treatment. The plaintiff's side argued that the residents in the hospital had committed no crime, but they were living in an institution that did not allow them to realistically lead a useful and meaningful life in society and return to society. They were placed in an institution that deprived them of a certain standard of care and no effective path to leading better lives. The defendants argued that they should be allowed the opportunity to set standards and make evaluations for submission to the court. To prove their point, the plaintiff's side brought in a patient, Ricky Wyatt, 15 years old, whose guardian was one of the former members bringing the lawsuit. Wyatt had no mental illness and was placed in the state hospital by the court to improve his behavior. After the arguments were presented in court, the court ruled on March 12, 1971, that patients who had been involuntarily admitted have the constitutional right to receive such individual treatment, and they will be given a realistic opportunity to be cured or to improve his or her mental condition. The court gave the defendants 6 months to show that they established standards and implemented a treatment program that is acceptable and follow the standards. The 3 fundamental conditions of a treatment plan to be considered effective in public mental institutions are: 1. A humane psychological and physical environment; 2. A sufficient number of qualified members to administer adequate treatment; and 3. Individualized treatment plans. At the time, the Bryce Hospital was lacking in all 3 of these conditions. However, they demonstrated the desire to meet those standards. The judge eventually applied the Wyatt standards, which detailed the basic requirements to adequately treat patients with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities. The judge also created a Human Rights Committee to oversee the implementation of those standards at each of the institutions that were required to meet those standards. Overall, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiff's side. The implications of this verdict were that it led to a couple of important mental disabilities laws. It led directly to the creation of Patients' Bill of Rights in most states and inspired the creation of the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, the mental health systems, and the federally funded protection and advocacy system. Also, the patients who were involuntarily committed to the Alabama mental institution have a constitutional right to treatment. Lastly, the rulings led to sweeping reforms in the nation's mental health systems and the creation of minimum standards of care and rehabilitation for people with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities. So the last case is Youngberg versus Romeo. The legal issue to be decided for this case is whether mentally retarded residents of state hospitals have the constitutional right to be free from undue bodily restraint, the right to personal security and protection, and the right to adequate treatment. The case Youngberg versus Romeo was a United States Supreme Court case regarding the rights of those who were involuntarily committed and with intellectual disabilities. The case was filed on January 11, 1982, and decided on June 18, 1982, in the United States Supreme Court. The plaintiff was Nicholas Romeo, a person with mental retardation who lived at home with his parents until the age of 26. Although 33 years old, he had the mental capacity of an 18-month-old child, with an IQ between 8 and 10. He could not talk and lacked the most basic self-care skills. After the death of Nicholas's father, his mother determined that she was unable to take care of Nicholas on her own. As a result, she involuntarily and permanently committed Nicholas to the Penhurst State School and Hospital, which is a Pennsylvania state facility. Over the time Nicholas Romeo spent in the facility, he was injured around 63 times by his own actions and by others at the facility. Ms. Romeo, Nicholas's mother, filed a federal lawsuit on her son's behalf against the facility's administrators, who were the defendants, since they knew or should have known about the injuries Romeo suffered and failed to take measures that would prevent them from happening again. The defendants argued that they were providing the treatments necessary to keep Romeo and others safe from each other and from harming themselves. The plaintiff's side claimed that the neglect Romeo encountered violated his constitutional rights, specifically the 8th Amendment, which is prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, and the 14th Amendment, which is due process guaranteed. The complaint asked for monetary damages and ordered relief. The request for individual ordered relief was rejected by the judge because Romeo was already involved in another class action case for another Supreme Court decision. As a result, the judge ruled in favor of the defendant, Penhurst. The Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit reversed the jury verdict and requested reconsideration through a new trial. The U.S. Supreme Court granted permission for the decision to be reviewed. The Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment's due process guarantee protected the rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities involuntarily committed to state institutions to reasonably safe standards of confinement, freedom from unreasonable bodily restraints, and minimally adequate training at those facilities. Overall, the plaintiff's side of the case won through a unanimous decision made by the judges. The implications of this verdict is that it serves as a landmark case in disability rights. This case was the first occasion where the Supreme Court reviewed and affirmed the constitutional due process liberty rights of involuntarily committed individuals who have developmental disabilities. Also, this case resulted in the court concluding that the state provide adequate or reasonable training and standards of care to ensure safety and freedom from undue restraint. For the reasonable or minimally adequate training, the court stressed that the judgment for meeting those standards are reviewed by a qualified individual, whose decisions are considered valid.